After the Supreme Court ruling yesterday, we thought maybe we'd have a quiet evening, but of course it doesn't look like that because President Biden decided to make a White House address to discuss his disgust with the Supreme Court as he proclaimed, "I dissent."
That's right. So as seems to be normal for the left, whenever there's an opinion out of the Supreme Court they disagree with, they have to go on the attack. They have to attack the actual institution of the Supreme Court. And what we got last night from President Biden, as you mentioned, was a White House address decrying the decision of the Supreme Court when it comes to presidential immunity, forgetting the fact that even some of the wording in the decision made reference to, like, if this weren't the case, presidents who've done maybe a poor job with the border could be subject to a rogue prosecutor.
Yeah, they would. Even the article that I was reading this morning from NBC News said, well, this also protects President Biden.
Right.
But of course, President Biden not thinking about that. His campaign is thinking about precisely that, the campaign, how this affects an election that's coming up in just a matter of months, not about the long-term implications of this. And as someone also probably in their mid-80s, doesn't really have us concerned with as much of the long-term implications of the law because we see how slow these things go. So when you start acting like, okay, I'm going to deal with this when I'm in my mid-90s, all right, we'll deal with that then.
The president broadens his attack on the Supreme Court of not just this decision, but a lot of the decisions they've made recently. Let's play bite 4.
This decision today has continued the court's attack in recent years on a wide range of long-established legal principles in our nation, from gutting voting rights and civil rights to taking away a woman's right to choose, to today's decision that undermines the rule of law of this nation.
There have been calls now for the impeachment. You saw that in the title, possibly, if you're watching on YouTube or on Rumble, the impeachment of the Supreme Court. And of course, this comes from some of the top leaders in the squad.
That's right. So this comes from your favorite Congresswoman and mine, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. She tweeted yesterday after the Supreme Court ruling, the Supreme Court has become consumed by a corruption crisis beyond its control. Today's ruling represents an assault on American democracy. It is up to Congress to defend our nation from this authoritarian capture. I intend on filing articles of impeachment upon our return.
My take is that AOC will simply file articles of impeachment against the conservative justices, the ones she doesn't like. So she will basically make a selective filing. But if you look at this in context, it's important to keep in mind Hakeem Jeffries, the House Minority Leader, he's also attacked the Supreme Court. He has said that the House will engage in aggressive oversight. Joe Biden has essentially suggested that the Supreme Court must be attacked because no one in the United States is king. These individuals fail to understand that this particular decision protects Democratic presidents just as much as it protects Republicans. And so one of the things to keep in mind is that during the Obama-Biden administration, targeted American citizens in Yemen and killed them. And this particular decision protects President Obama and arguably protects Joe Biden. So this particular decision requires a balanced review, and we should anticipate that anything that comes from the mouth of AOC, Hakeem Jeffries, and Joe Biden will be unbalanced.
It seems like the left read the opinion and then quickly changed their tune from there's some limited immunity to this is literally the worst thing in the world. Democracy is over. The president had to give a speech from the White House, quoting from the dissent of Sotomayor. And what do you think was that there? They were first trying to get a capture on the narrative by downplaying it, or do you think they just hadn't read it yet?
Well, I think it's probably both. And I think once they read it and once they digested it, they realized that their worst fears were being realized. Donald Trump would not likely face trial on the January 6th election interference claim until 2025, probably at the earliest. And if he wins the presidency, more likely than not, he will never face charges with respect to that activity. But what these individuals fail to realize is that the Supreme Court is looking at history. It is saying there is something called the separation of powers. And yes, presidents are entitled to absolute immunity with respect to official acts. They're not entitled to absolute immunity with respect to unofficial acts. And the president is entitled to the presumption of absolute immunity. And so one of the things that I think is imperative with respect to your questions, Will, is that the left digested the opinion and then began to freak out. Why? Because the left realized that Joe Biden cannot beat Donald Trump in a fair and free election.
The sentencing of President Trump in Manhattan. And it, on the face of this ruling, it doesn't seem like it would apply at all to the case that was there. That had to do with the campaign. It had to do with business records, not what you would consider presidential acts, because he wasn't the president when they alleged these crimes happened. But what you saw yesterday was quickly the Trump team file a letter to the judge ahead of the July 11th sentencing. So that would be next Thursday when President Trump was scheduled to be sentenced, asking for a delay in that sentencing and also in light of the Supreme Court's ruling. And they highlighted something interesting, was that some of the evidence that Alvin Bragg brought into this case was evidence that he procured while the president was president. And what the attorneys are trying to argue is that there's an angle here where, reading the Supreme Court's opinion, if they're using as evidence something that was an official act, that can't be used and taken as evidence against him.
If you look at the Trump attorney's letter, it is actually grounded in logic, because Alvin Bragg adduced evidence which basically was procured after Donald Trump took office. And so Donald Trump engaged arguably in official acts with respect to election finance and other related matters, which Alvin Bragg referred to at trial. So even though the conduct at issue that was charged against Donald Trump basically referred to conduct which occurred before he took office, some of the conduct actually occurred afterwards. So if Alvin Bragg still wants to rely on the evidence tied to Trump's conduct after he took office, then it's very possible that we need, A, to delay the sentence, but B, we may need to reopen the trial in order to basically eliminate such evidence on which the jurors relied. That, I think, is a very important issue.
We even discussed that. It seemed as though it wouldn't affect it at all, but as the attorneys were able to pull out, there was evidence which should have been precluded because of this ruling. And now that is still a long shot, I would think, and I'm sure the professor agrees with me on
Absolutely.
that. But it at least adds an element of uncertainty. And as of right now, it appears that the judge and Alvin Bragg is not opposing delaying that sentence, which was supposed to be handed down next Thursday.